test Wednesday, approximately 40 multiple choice questions, and most of you at least will need a stand card. Now, for the pass, it's 12 questions. Now, here's the only study guide I'll give. I'm about to talk about the pass questions in the next few minutes. Also, if you go online, I talked about the pass during the morning class. So I might have said something to them that I might overlook saying to you. Now, folks, it's difficult to make a cause and effect when it comes to human behavior, because human behavior is unpredictable. You don't know what makes for a cause might not create the same effect next time. Now, for instance, all of you will be hearing my voice, and all of you will be taking the same test, but you won't necessarily make the same grade. Again, human behavior is a little bit unpredictable. Now, having said that, here's one of the past questions, folks. Cortez heard a bunch of hideous screams coming from the Montezuma's temple. So he asked through his interpreter, what's the meaning of these screams? The interpreter replied back, oh, these are people being offered to the sun god as a sacrifice. Now to Cortez, this whole idea was sickening. Now none of us know what we would have done if we had been there. But Cortez destroyed Montezuma's empire and stopped the sacrificing, and believed he was fully justified in doing so. Because these people were so evil, he felt like they needed to be stopped. And in today's politically correct world, I don't know what we would do under the same circumstances. That's one. Cause, hideous screams. Effect, he moved in to solve the problem. Now again, not every one of us would have acted that way, perhaps. Maybe none of us would have. That's one example. Now, another example. And you have a civilization, and these civilized people are being surrounded by the uncivilized. Very, very often there's a clash. Now, I'm not going to say inevitably. There's hardly anything about history that's inevitable. Karl Marx believed that history was inevitable. But oftentimes there's a clash. Which side usually wins?
Uncivilized.
The uncivilized. And we'll be talking about that when we go through this chapter on Rome. Rome was the last of the great old-time civilizations that fell. All right, now, dynasties start, come along when some powerful person builds them up, and what usually happens to dynasties over time, almost always? They fall, they come to nothing. They're overthrown, and a new dynasty takes over. Now, here's one. This should be obvious. There have been movements that have tried to take over the world. Among them, Islam, communism, Nazism, fascism. They become very, very large. Now, what is the result? To make long story, their goal was to take over the world. Have they done it?
Yeah.
Have not. Not yet. Of course, one reason is they, after a while, start infighting among themselves. They become quite large and start fighting among themselves. But whatever, they generally do not take over the world. Now, here's one, folk, and I have mentioned this. Plato taught us that the material world we live in was an inferior place. Well, persons who have followed his teachings have tended to do what scientifically? I mean, which direction have they gone scientifically? Now, Aristotle disagreed with Plato, and Aristotle studied the world. But unfortunately, most of Plato's pupils followed his teachings, and the result was their societies went down and down and down. All right, here's one. Now, this is something Hitler tried also. Sparta believed that it could create a race of super warriors by killing all of its weak boys, killing them when they were babies and killing them as they were growing up, they appear to be weak. So what was the result? Sparta became practically extinct. Now Hitler tried the same thing. In neither case did they create a super race. Now, on a personal note, I was standing next to the high school head coach one time, watching a bunch of 9 and 10 and 11-year-old boys play a game of football. They were playing on the high school field, so and the coach was standing there watching them. And I said, "Can you tell?" Said the coach, "Can you tell which of these boys are going to become football players when we get to high school?" He said, "There's no way to tell. These boys had not gone through puberty yet, and there's no way to tell what's going to come out, what they were going to turn out once they became pubescent and got older. By the time they got to high school, the big boys might be little boys might be big boys. No way to tell." So what Sparta did, who knows, they might have destroyed some 250 and 300-pound soldiers who were puny when they were little. This is highly possible, in fact, highly likely. Or even in a lot of cases, these puny little boys might have produced sons and grandsons who were 250, 300-pound warriors. Too bad they got rid of them as babies and they did not grow up. So again, the results were not what Sparta wanted. Now, oh yes, here's one, and this is one I did not mention in the other class. So, the Byzantine Empire united church and state. Now, in our country, we believe in separating church and state. The Muslim world unites mosque and state. What's generally the result of nations that unite religion and state? They fail. In most cases, this is highly true. Again, you can make exceptions if you want to, but in most cases, it's highly true.
So what was the question?
The Byzantine Empire, Western Europe, and to some extent Latin America also in the 20th century even, and 19th century, united church with state. The Muslim world does this. The result, countries that unite church and state usually lag behind the countries that don't. And I think I mentioned this one. When people keep on spending more money than they take in, eventually the creditors get to where they won't loan them any more money, they go bankrupt. The same thing, folk, can happen to governments. The United States thinks it's immune. I don't think so. Now, Aristotle taught us that money was sterile. Money could never grow more money. Money could never beget any more money. In other words, he did not believe in loaning money with interest, therefore he didn't believe in banks. He did not believe that money should be invested in hopes of gain. And the economics of the people who have followed his teachings, I mean, not as individuals, but as nations. Nations who have followed his teaching have tended to be have what kind of economy? Generally a low economy. Without banks, folk. Without banks, most of us will never have cars, will never have houses, will never have some of the finer things of life. Banks get us through rough times. Oh yeah, we can overdraw, borrow. It's possible, and at one point or another in our lives, most of us probably will. I did. All right. Again, you can't say that these things are always true, but I picked out about 12 ideas that are generally true, and I think most of them I've mentioned at one point or another during the class. Now, anybody have any further questions on the past? The past is not multiple choice, by the way. I think I might have mistakenly told you what you have to write in the answers, like you did the first two tests. And you write them right there on the sheet of paper I hand out. So now, there might be a couple of you who need to make up a test with me. Please see me about that. Now again, this is not high school, and I'm not going to go looking around the hallways for you trying to hunt you down. You have to find me. Are we clear on that issue? All right, hopefully we're clear. I mean, this is college. If you need to make up a test, you find me or you see me. Or now, I can't do it tonight. I mean, I have a concert tonight. But now, on one of these days, either on Monday or Wednesday, when it's convenient for you and me both, and I'm here from 7 o'clock in the morning till 4 in the afternoon, On Monday, I can stay later. So if any of those times is convenient, except between 8:30 and 9:45 I have a class, and of course at 2:30 to 3:45 I have a class. Except for those times, I'm free. So if you can find me, and I usually stay put. I'm upstairs in the part-time faculty office, and I'm right there between classes, or right there in the morning before my first class. If you can see me, but again, folks, this is college. You have to find me to make that good makeup. One of you, I think, already has, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe it was another class. I gave him the makeup. All right. Okay. Now, having asked that, now, any other questions? Now, let me remind you something I said earlier, and not everybody's here to hear this. So, folks, come 3:45, I really need to get out of here. Now, if you want to talk to me in the hall, I'll talk to you, but when I'm here, I need to clear out my stuff and get out of here pretty quickly, because there's another teacher who's right here ready to, I'm not going to say push me out, but you get the idea. You know, I'm supposed to be out of here at that time. So try to understand. But yeah, I do meet with some of you in the hall, and we can talk in the hall. All right, any other questions? Again, a lot of times they'll say, hey, please, I wish you would have asked that when the whole class was here. Because some of you are trying to get an extra edge on some of your classmates by trying to get me to reveal to you something I don't reveal to the whole class, and I don't like doing that. All right. Okay, we'll move on. Okay, Augustus. Caesar Augustus. By the way, you might have noticed, the month of July was named after Julius Caesar. The month of August was named after Caesar Augustus. Both months are 31 days long, and both months were the hottest months in the year. I think they both liked those months because of the fact that living in the northern hemisphere, as they did, they were the hot months. Now, Caesar Augustus ruled for some 45 years. He was quite popular. For one thing, he brought peace. I mean, the Roman people had gone through the Punic Wars. When the Punic Wars ended, they'd gone through a war between Marius and Sulla. They'd gone through a war between Julius Caesar and Pompey. Then gone through a war between Caesar Augustus and Mark Antony. There was 3 civil wars back to back. In 3 generations, every generation had to fight a civil war. But with Caesar Augustus, the civil wars ended. And it was to be a long time before Rome had to fight another big war. Now, he feared assassination, as had happened to his adopted father, Julius Caesar. So unlike Julius Caesar, he set up the Praetorian Guard. I'm not going to write that down. It was just want you to be aware of it. The Praetorian Guard was like our Secret Service. He said the Praetorian Guard, unlike what happened to Julius Caesar, the Praetorian Guard would actually accompany him, fully armed, into the Senate chamber. And that way he felt protected. And if anyone came after him, they'd have to go through his guards also. So he ruled as an autocrat, but he was really careful to try to make it appear that he was abiding by Roman law. He gave back some powers to the Senate that had been taken from the Senate by Julius Caesar, in other words, all in an attempt to make himself look popular. And he had himself addressed as princeps, and I'm going to write this one down. From this word princeps, we get the word prince. If you know anything about royalty, the prince is not the top. He's a member of the royal family, but he's not necessarily the top. He's just one of maybe several of them. And so during the Senate meetings, instead of sitting at the head in front of everybody else, he would sit among the senators like he was one of them. Yes?
I can't read.
Princeps. I put that word in italics because it is a foreign word. Princeps. And he would make it appear that he was sharing his power with the Senate. But all told, he was peaceful. And his reign was popular. He recruited his army mostly from Italians, got back the old practice, forgetting what Marius had done by recruiting the army from every which way. His army consisted mostly of Italians, but he had one big mishap. He thought he could repeat Julius Caesar's conquest, so he did not go himself, but he sent an army to conquer Germany. I mean, Germany was right here next to France. Julius Caesar conquered France. Almost every soldier he sent to conquer Germany was killed. And he was seen many a time just going around his palace, just crying his eyes out and saying, "Give me back my army, give me back my army." He never really got over the loss of his army. He made a law that Roman emperors after him were not to try to conquer Germany. That might have been one of the biggest mistakes he made, but actually later a Roman army did go and conquer much of Germany. The Roman Emperor Hadrian broke Caesar Augustus' law. By that time, Caesar Augustus had been dead for nearly 100 years anyway. Broke the law and went in and did conquer Germany. Now, here's where he made another one of his big mistakes. There were a lot of poor people who were idle, out of work. Okay, folk, when I use the word idle, I'm surprised at how many college students do not know what this word means. In this case, it means they were simply out of work. They had nothing to do. Caesar Augustus' solution to the problem was feed them and entertain them. And it became known down through history as bread and circuses. Give them gladiatorial shows where gladiators would fight each other to death. Keep them fed. Give them circuses. Give them free access to circuses, and everybody would be happy. Done at government expense. Now, here's what the problem with that turned out to be. At first, there was not the majority of people were getting this free food, free handouts. But as time went on, a higher and higher and higher and higher percentage of the Romans got these free handouts. And every Roman knew, hey, if I fail, if I just decide I don't want to work anymore, the emperor is going to take care of me. Folk, I will remind you, the first term paper I ever did, I finished it 50 years ago, yes, that long. It was entitled, "Is American Society Following in the Footsteps of the Roman Empire?" There were some things I did not know about then and know about now, but it looked to me more and more like. Now, it's been, let's see, this time last year, had a young man sit right there in the front row, and he said, "I do not believe America can be conquered." Nobody in the class agreed with him, at least not out loud. I certainly did not agree with him, and I don't. Here's why. Rome was conquered, all right. But first they were conquered from within, not from without. Then eventually, of course, they were conquered from without. Now, I'll have more to say about these lower class people later and more to say about the entertainment. Augustus saw that there was a decline in moral standards. He recalled the olden days when a Roman couple would marry and stay married for life. But in his day, divorce was very common. And he tried to stem the tide of divorce, even though regrettably his own marriage, he could not get to work, and he wound up divorcing his own wife. But he tried to outlaw adultery. He also tried to limit the amount of money one could spend on a party. Well, to some extent, I mean, his laws weren't enforced. The public parties. These people would get to parties that lasted over 3 or 4 days on end, and they would just eat and eat and eat and drink unlimited, go out and regurgitate what they eat and go back and party some more. This is known to have greatly shortened their lives. And but Caesar Augustus believed that this was wrong also. He tried to limit the amount of money one could spend on a party. He tried to outlaw adultery. But his laws had very little effect. The tide of immorality and broken homes and just continued all the way through. It was to be another 400 years before, more than 400 years after he was gone, before the empire actually finally collapsed. But he saw the collapse coming and tried to turn things around. The job was bigger than any one man could do. Now Another thing about Caesar Augustus I want to mention now, he was the Roman emperor when Jesus was born, and his name is mentioned in the Bible, the Christmas story, that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus. It's known he made several tax laws, but he made a tax law one time that all the Roman Empire should be taxed. And it was during one of these taxings when Jesus' parents had to go to Bethlehem, and there Jesus was born. Anyway, I'll have more to say about Christianity later. After Julius Caesar, after Caesar Augustus, the next one was Tiberius. Now, just like Caesar Augustus had been an adopted son of Julius Caesar, Tiberius was an adopted son of Caesar Augustus. Again, most of these emperors would look for a promising young boy and adopt him because their own son, natural son, just didn't seem to show the promise. Whereas a son who did not grow up in the palace oftentimes would show more promise. Seemed to be a little bit more intelligent, more charismatic, or have more of the qualities that he was looking for in an emperor. So Tiberius was Caesar Augustus' adopted son, but by his appointment was almost like establishing dynastic rule. And for much of the history of the Roman Empire after this, the emperors were dynastic. It was father and son. Tiberius took back a lot of the power that Caesar Augustus given to the Senate, and more power then was given to the emperor at the expense of the Senate. Tiberius had to live through several assassination plots, but he survived them all. One of them was done by a well thought out, well carried out plot. It was thought out by his chief butler, but somehow Tiberius Caesar got wind of it, and on the day of the plot had the butler killed, surprising to the butler because the butler did not know anyone was in on his plot. So on and so forth. He was the emperor during the public ministry of Christ, and for many generations we thought that probably Tiberius knew nothing about it, but recent research has led us in on the fact that Tiberius might actually have been very much aware of what was going on in Judea and was watching the events closely, and that is why Pontius Pilate was so afraid when Jesus brought to him. He was afraid he'd have to answer to the emperor, which he did, but it was on another charge that his Pilate had to answer to the emperor later. But he was emperor during the time of Christ's public ministry and crucifixion. Now, we'll skip a few emperors. The first three, Julius Caesar, Caesar Augustus, Tiberius Caesar, we'll skip a few and get to one. Now, until Saddam Hussein, until Stalin, until Hitler and Mussolini, Nero was looked on as being one of the worst type of ruler you could ever have. And if you ever see on a multiple choice test 2 of the 5 good emperors, if Nero is one of the choices, go on to another choice. Yeah.
Nero enrolled during the fall of Rome.
What's that?
Was he enrolled during the fall of Rome?
Was he?
Enrolled during the fall of Rome.
No, Nero, Rome fell many years after Nero had died. But see, here's what you might be confused about. During his tenure, a big fire occurred in Rome. Now, again, folk, we don't know the truth of the story. Because we don't know who started the fire. Some accounts say that Nero was fiddling while Rome burned. Others say, no, he actually was out of the city when he got the news that Rome was on fire. He hurried back to the city and tried to direct the job of putting it out. Here was Nero's problem. It wasn't so much he started out so mean or wicked. He actually grew up in the royal palace. He was a member of the royal family. And while he was growing up, he never thought he'd be emperor. There were several ahead of him. All right, but all the persons ahead of him died along the way. He took up music, he took up theatrics, he took up art. Never intending to become emperor, but all of a sudden one morning it was like he woke up and he said to him, hey, you're emperor. Oh, me? Yeah, yes, you're the emperor. You're the next in line. And the other emperor died. He simply was not capable of handling it. He never started out as a heartless tyrant. Now, there is a story that shortly after he became emperor, somebody led an insurrection to try to overthrow him. Well, the person who tried to overthrow him was caught, apprehended. Because he was highborn, only Nero could sign his death warrant. You know, I mean, it's just something that kings have to do. If somebody rebels against you, you have to kill them. I mean, you know, this is no other choice. So they brought the paperwork to him and said, Nero, sign here so we can execute this man who tried to take your throne. If I sign this, you're going to kill this man? They said, yes, yes, your majesty. This is what you, now come on, you're emperor now, you have to do this. Nero was really upset and he finally signed it. Ooh, I wish I never had learned to write. Now later in his life, he was signing death warrants without any conscience about it. The first time he signed a death warrant, it really bothered him. Well, he went on. He ruled as he pleased, killing everyone who stood in his way. The people turned against him. When the fire broke out, the Romans blamed him for starting the fire. They also said that he was sitting there fiddling while Rome burned. Again, this cannot be actually proven. I mean, all kinds of stories get out, and 2,000 years later, we don't know what the truth is. He blamed the fire on the Christians. And this led to the first Roman-wide persecution of Christians just 30 years after Christ had left this world. Actually, yeah, 30 years, about AD 64, thereabouts. Rome was, did I say AD? CE, folk. I mean, I've got to get used to it. CE. Anyway, Nero led the first empire-wide persecution of Christians, but the people still did not like him any better, even though a lot of them did not favor Christianity. He finally stabbed himself, and as he stabbed himself, he said, "What an artist dies in me." And his name has gone down in history as a symbol of heartless cruelty, especially after Christianity took over the Western world. He became an example of a persecutor, a very evil person at that. Now, as time went on, these emperors, all of whom were members of the royal family, the same family, called the Julio-Claudian rule because it went from Julius Caesar to Claudius Caesar. The Julio-Claudian rule, these emperors did not even pretend anymore to rule by the consent of the Senate. They wound up taking on more and more powers. They pretended that they were appointed by the Senate, and they were not hereditary rulers. In actual reality, they really were hereditary rulers. They began to act more and more arbitrarily, and they began to gain more and more power until after a while there was no more pretense of a republic. It was all an empire now, ruled by divine right emperors. All right, 5 good emperors. Now, the good emperors, their names are, and I do want to hold you responsible for them, Nerva, Trajan, let's see, I put it right tab better. N-E-R, Trajan, Hadrian, Antonius Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. Now, these 5 emperors ruled for a period of 70 years. Do the math, that means they had an average of 14 years apiece. Some of you might have heard of Marcus Aurelius. He's been in a few movies. He had in some ways the most exciting and in other ways the most tragic time of it all. Now, these 5 good emperors, they extended the boundaries of Rome. In fact, Hadrian, under him, in CE 117, don't worry about the date, the emperor reached his greatest height. He broke Caesar Augustus' law and conquered part of Germany. Now again, folks, the people you don't conquer oftentimes come back to haunt you later. He did not get all of Germany. He got a lot of Germany. These emperors did a lot of public works. They built bridges, built roads, built aqueducts. An aqueduct would carry fresh water into the city. Oftentimes they'd start an aqueduct with some mountain stream that was fairly pure, and then they'd flow this water through the aqueduct And these aqueducts were so well built that some of them are actually still in service in Italy to this day and have been for more than 2,000 years. Sometimes they go in and repair them. These old stones will sometimes crumble, but they've repaired them. These aqueducts are still carrying water into some of Italy's cities and towns. But they built theaters, harbors, and all kinds of other civic projects, Capitol domes. During that period of time, Rome enjoyed peace and prosperity, and Rome bragged for 200 years about a Pax Romana, or Roman peace. And it was during this time that Christianity got to spread more and more throughout the empire, even though most of these emperors were avid persecutors of Christianity. One after another, it seemed like the more energetic emperors persecuted Christianity the most. Antonius Pius, if you wonder about that last name, he had an unusual devotion towards his gods, the Greek and Roman gods, so he got the name Pius attached to his name, and that's how he's come down to us as Antonius Pius, because he was extremely religious. Now, in all 5 of these cases, these 5 men ruled one after the other. They adopted as their son the next one. Now, in the case of Marcus Aurelius, this came to an end. Marcus Aurelius, his son, got the throne, his real actual son, and the Roman Empire went downhill pretty fast after that, because Marcus Aurelius' son was far from capable of becoming emperor, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Now, folk, I'm hesitant to tell this, but after doing some research on it, I wanted to mention it. I did mention the morning class. In every one of these 5 cases, the relationship between the emperor and the next one he appointed was sexual also. Again, in the case of men and boys. I don't want to elaborate on that any further, but this is simply, I mean, this was the way politics was played in those days. And yes, Julius Caesar got to be general of the army by engaging in sexual liaisons with a general who was older than he was. This was a way that you could get promotions in the army. This was a way you could even get to become emperor if the other emperor liked you. If the emperor who was in power chose you and picked you. All right. Nevertheless, again, this was politics. Manufacturing reached heights it had never reached before. Trade, agriculture, all thrived. Now, a lot of this, folk, may have been, you can't prove it, but a lot of this thriving in agriculture may have been due to global warming. You can't quite prove it back that far. You can prove it when you get to the 1300s, 1600s. In the 1300s, we had a cooling off. Actually, in the 11 and 1200s, Europe became hot, and everything was just wonderful and great. In the 1300s, Europe cooled down, and 1/3 of Europe's population died as a result of Black Death. And China experienced the plagues at the same time. Then came the Little Ice Age of the late 1600s, and it carried off upper and lower class life, and 2 million people in India are known to have died, not to mention millions of people in Europe and China also. Again, it was likely caused. In fact, we know that the last big dying off of the people in the northern hemisphere was caused by global cooling. We can pretty well prove that. This prosperity might have been caused in part by a heating up time. There were some problems, so it's an old saying, things were never better, things were never worse. Underneath this prosperity, there was the army. The army lacked a strong reserve. Now, this weakness was to really hurt it. Now, what is a reserve? Simply, when I joined the Army in 1979, I actually joined the Georgia National Guard, which is a branch of the Army. The Army consists of the Guards. The Guard is under the control of the governor of the state, except in time of emergency. The Reserve is under control of the federal government. But these Guardsmen and Reservists only go for 1 month for 1 weekend a month to be trained. And then they spend 2 weeks during the summer in a summer camp. And but they're a big part of the Army. There's a way that the Army can maintain at least a reserve that they can call on in time of emergency. and maintain it cheaply rather than having to pay full-time troops. Your guardsmen and reservists usually have civilian jobs. Again, some of you might wind up joining the Guard or Reserve someday, but Rome did not have a reserve. Now, this is something I'm about to say is very, very important. During the time of these 5 good emperors, which we're talking about the late 1st century and the early 2nd century, around the year 100, plus or minus, was a few years either way. During the time, Rome's population reached 50 million. Now, what is significant about that is that by the year 300 and 350, Rome's population declined to 30 million. Now, I had a student do a paper on that and said, well, if the people moved from the city to the countryside, oh, didn't happen, because they still, I mean, if some of your people move from the city to the country, you still have the same population. No, what actually happened was they died off and were not replaced. All right, what killed these 20 million people over a period of 200 years to where, I mean, of course, granted, nobody lives that long, but supposedly as you die, you have children to replace the ones that are dying. What actually happened was the old people died off without producing children. Now, what I'm getting at, folks, is the population decline was not caused by wars. There hardly were any. It was not caused by plague. There weren't very many. It was not caused by famine. Sometimes, folk, mankind's worst enemy is prosperity. The people became lazy and became more and more dependent on the state for their livelihood. And you had a larger number of divorces, which I'll talk about when I come to family life. I'll talk about it in a few minutes. A large number of divorces and a very large number of adults who never married at all. It increased the number of bachelors and old maids. Now, I want to introduce you to 2 words, urban and rural. Generally, an urban society where most of the people are urban is considered a sign of advancement. I mean, let's face it, folks, to put together something like an airplane, I mean, which the Romans could not even dream about, but it takes a lot of people living in close proximity to each other. So, to put together, again, any kind of machinery, even an automobile, takes a lot of people living in close proximity to each other, and the food they eat has to be grown by somebody else, because for the most part, people who put together automobiles, airplanes, or computers don't have time to grow their own gardens. So urban means you have urban means city, a large city dwelling population. Rural is country. Now, during the time of prosperity, Rome became more and more urban and less rural. Now, you always had rural people. Now, during Europe's dark ages that came after the fall of the Roman Empire, there was very little urban area and it became mostly rural, and for hundreds of years, maybe 1,000 years, Europe was mostly rural and less urban. Today, of course, Europe is mostly urban and less rural. The United States is now mostly urban and less rural. But as recently as the Civil War, there were 60% of American people were farmers, and 40% had other occupations. Today, less than 1 out of 20 Americans are farmers, and their sons and daughters are not wanting to take up farming. So I don't know who's going to do farming when our present farmers have all retired. But maybe somebody to fill in, somebody who can't find a job doing anything else. Now, another thing that was wrong with Rome, though, as time went on, the gap between the rich and poor widened. The rich got richer, the poor got poorer, and after a while there was no middle class left. Now this has several, because the middle class are oftentimes the backbone of society. I mean, with the upper class being like the head, and the lower class being the body, well, in the middle there's a backbone. The middle class usually takes care of the lower level government jobs. With no middle class, and only an upper class, it discourages your ordinary person moving up. Now, I don't mind telling you folk, I mean, I grew up in poverty, but I'm up now in an occupation that's considered upper middle class. So, a college teacher, I had made my mind when I was 18, I'm not going to live like I grew up. There was any way I know I could afford it. So I went to college, stayed in college a while, and used my college degree to get several jobs, one after another. I did not become a college teacher right away, but basically, and my mother told me, to her credit, you should get above your raising. If you grew up in poverty, and probably most of you didn't, I don't know, I'm not going to ask. That doesn't mean you have to stay there. But now back to Roman times, it meant if they grew up in poverty, they stayed there. And until very recently, if you were in Latin America, where that they had an extremely high rich class, which consisted of a few, and everybody else was really, really poor, they had little chance of moving up. Now that has changed in Latin America. Latin America has a growing middle class, I understand, and today a person who grows up in the lower class can have at least a hope or a chance of becoming middle class, maybe even upper middle class. But the gap between rich and poor widened. Then the governing class, more and more as time went on, Rome began to pick its governors from the provinces rather than pick Italians. Now, you might think this was good. Was it really? It meant that the people who were governing had less and less interest and less interest in the welfare of Rome, and more interest in the welfare of their own locality. Before this time, the Roman government sent its own Italian people, leading citizens, to be the rulers and governors of the provinces. Now they began to pick their own local people. In the case of Rome, it seems like this was a mistake. Today we'd say, if any of you would say, well, wait, what's wrong with picking a Greek to be a ruler over a Greek province? Maybe in our days that isn't wrong, but at that time it was, because it symbolized, hey, we don't have enough talent here among the Italians, so let's pick Greeks, let's pick people from Gaul, let's pick Spanish people, and let them be the rulers because we don't have enough talent here in Rome to be the rulers. All right. Okay, Roman culture. Roman culture became more and more Greek as time went on, and not every Roman liked this. They, of course, were always worshiping Greek gods. But the Greeks had, I have to judge them for this, they had a bad family life. And when the Greeks intermingled with the Romans, the Romans started having less of an ideal family life. And a lot of Romans resisted the Greek influence and said, hey, we didn't have problems with immorality, we didn't have problems with adultery, we didn't have all these other problems until the Greeks came in. And the Greeks were often blamed for the decline in Roman life. Now, some of the main Roman cultural influences, most of them were not philosophers, but the people whose writings have come down to us. And yes, there's quite a bit. I had one of your classmates say there's a lot of material here. I can't apologize for it, folk. You're competing with everybody else. You have to keep up. But here's some of the names I want you to remember. Virgil, he linked Rome to Greece. One of Rome's more famous poets. Now, Ovid. Now, you think that we have a problem with pornography. The Romans did too. This was something I was not aware of when I did my paper 50 years ago. Ovid, a lot of his works were what we today would consider pornographic. Now, he came into conflict with Caesar Augustus, who was trying to restore traditional morality, and finally Caesar Augustus told him to get out of Italy and stay out. And Ovid spent the rest of his life in exile. But he ridiculed any form of traditional morality, and basically he called for free, unrestrained, unbridled sex. A lot of people just loved his philosophy and followed it. And this led to an outbreak of herpes. Now, we might think of herpes as a modern-day disease. The fact of the matter is they had it in Roman times, and they knew right away how it spread. And Caesar Augustus tried to stop the spread of herpes, again, by trying to outlaw adultery and trying to outlaw public kissing, and as much as he possibly could, trying to outlaw prostitution. Again, it was somewhat ineffective. Herpes became a big problem and was to remain so during much of the rest of the Roman period. It somewhat died, the disease somewhat died down during the Dark Ages when travel was not as widespread. Then it made a comeback in modern times. Livy wrote the history of Rome, and much of his history, again, we don't believe today, owing to the fact that some of the people, their moral fiber seems to be too high. Livy, that man's name is Livy. Now, here's one I really want you to remember, Tacitus. Tacitus was the only one of these historians. Of course, Livy wrote before Jesus was born, but he's the only one who mentions Jesus in his writings. And he said that Jesus was born in Judea and that he founded the sect of Christianity. Tacitus was hard against Christianity, but he saw it as a spreading religion and believed it was a spreading blight on the empire, which he said should somehow be eradicated. But again, he had no doubts of the existence of Jesus. But he's one of the few outside the Gospels who wrote about him, whose life overlapped that of Jesus's. Tacitus also wrote about Germans, and both he pictured the Germans as being a noble race of tall, blonde people with their bright blue eyes and very white skin. And without realizing that eventually these blonde people with the bright blue eyes and light skin were going to come down and conquer Rome. But he had a high opinion of the Germans. Cicero. Cicero was born into wealth. He was a great public speaker, a great orator. And it was said that when he spoke to the Roman Senate and Julius Caesar was saying that Julius Caesar trembled. What did Cicero have to say? Again, Cicero would say things to Caesar, things to the whole Senate, like, a private person should not have an army. The army belongs only to the state. And there was Caesar sitting there, he had his own private army. He'd also say, democracy is the best government that mankind has ever had. Anyone who tries to overthrow democracy will himself be overthrown. And there was Caesar, he'd overthrown the democracy, and he had reason to believe that somebody would indeed overthrow him. And of course, you know, they did stab him with 40-some knife wounds. They counted out 42 knife wounds. So maybe he had, otherwise, Julius Caesar might have been paranoid. But as Cicero would speak, Julius Caesar would seem to become very weak. Now, Roman art. They didn't excel very much in paintings, even though they had paintings. Their real excellence was in their way that they got a stone roof on stone buildings, particularly the arch. The arch gave way to the vault. The vault is just an arch that extends, I'll try to draw one like this, extends somewhat like the old-fashioned Indian river. The arch, the vault. Now the arches oftentimes had a special stone on top called the keystone or the capstone to be on top. Now, the arch is really a very strong geometric figure. You might not realize. Submarines are doing the same thing the arch is when they make submarines with a circular shape. Now, folk, in my class this morning, only one or two persons said they'd seen this done. I have done it. And sometimes it fails. You take an ordinary hen egg, and if you can cup it in your hands, the right way, both hands, you can squeeze with all your might, and even the strongest of men can barely crack it, if they crack it at all. My high school teacher said he's seen high school football players who weigh 200 pounds who could take these hen eggs and squeeze them. Again, if you have to cup them in the palm of your hand just the right way, you get equal pressure on all sides, and it will not crack. Now again, if this egg has a crack in it already with the least bit of an imperfection, it will collapse into 100 little pieces, and you'll get egg white and egg yolk all over your hand. But that's why I'm not about to try. But have any ever seen this done or know it being done? One head's nodding, two heads are nodding yes. Okay, at least 3, 4, okay, 4 people have seen it done. It does, you've tried it, does it work for you? Okay, well, again, maybe you're stronger than some of the rest of it, and maybe you happen to have a defective egg. In most cases, it has not worked for me, but I tried it at home with my mother's eggs. Some of the times it actually worked. There were some eggs that were perfect enough that they would not crack. Again, the dome is used on almost every state capital in the country, and the national capital has a dome. And if you have seen any pictures of Washington, D.C. lately, or been there lately, you know that our Capitol dome is under some extensive repair and rework right now. It was put together, if it had been put together in the 20th century, but it wasn't. It was put together in the 19th, and was using standards of building that are not up to today's standards. So we're having to redo it. But they excelled again, the dome, the vault, and the arch, but this way they could get a stone roof over a stone structure. Now, Roman law. I can't emphasize enough that Rome did not have a constitution that defined, the constitution did not define the powers of government. That's why emperors could sometimes take liberty to give certain powers to the Senate or take certain powers back. No, we have not had a case where our president has taken powers from Congress per se. Well, yes, we have. I mean, our present president is accused of taking powers from Congress right and left. But I will say this, our Supreme Court is taking powers that are not defined explicitly in the Constitution. And they are ruling like philosopher kings, ruling by decree, and making all of the nation's moral decisions for us without the common ordinary person having any say-so whatever. This, folk, was not the intent of the framers. But the Romans, again, they did not define, but they did have law, and they believed in what they called natural law that was originally written on 12 tables. Now, what was natural law? They said that they believed that we could determine natural law just by plain, simple reasoning. And of course, obviously, murder was considered to be wrong. Stealing was considered to be wrong. And habitual offenders were executed. They always gave their citizens at least a trial before they differentiated between citizen and non-citizen. The citizens had rights, the non-citizens generally did not. Now, I want to elaborate here on this thing about natural law. When Germany, this is recent, folks, recent when your grandparents were young, when Germany killed 15 million people, innocent people in World War II, not soldiers, but just starved them to death, overworked them, used them as human experiments or burned them in ovens. At the end of the war, the victorious Allies decided to try the offenders as criminals. Well, the defense surprised the prosecution. The defense initially opened up the judge that any sovereign state should be allowed to do anything to its own citizens that it wants, and nobody from outside should have any say-so in how any sovereign state deals with citizens. The prosecution was so taken aback by that defense that they called for a recess, and they huddled together in one corner of the room for 20 minutes. How should we respond to a defense like this? I mean, to them, the idea of taking innocent people and putting them in ovens was just naturally against. But they said each state had its own law, and there's no such thing as a universal law that should apply to everybody. It did not fly. The defense did not fly. A lot of these people were hung, were given long prison sentences, and as part of the process of denazification, which we don't talk about anymore, but it did go on. Many of the Nazis were hung, and after a few years, they quit denazifying Germany anymore. But they believed that there was natural law which applied to every situation and every person, and what applied to one country applied to another. All right, Roman family life. Originally, Roman family life was dominated by the father. It's called a pater family. Father. The word pater has to do with the Latin word for father. Pater family, yeah. And the father was so strongly the head of the house They even had the right to kill children who disagreed with him or who rose in rebellion against him. He had the right to execute his own children, his own family. And a few fathers did in the ancient world. King Herod had 6 sons and executed 3 of them. But as time went on, the father's power diminished. Now, again, whether this was bad or good, I mean, obviously with our 21st century mind, we say, oh, the fathers should not have all these rights. I have to say this, but we allow our women to do the same thing. It's called abortion, but to decide whether or not they want to carry a baby to term or not. So I don't know if we can say there's a difference. But anyway, the father had the right to kill children who disagreed with him. Now, at first, in the earlier part of Roman times, divorce was uncommon. But then as time went on, and as Rome became more peaceful and prosperous, divorce became the norm. And, folk, it was the rich who were more likely to get divorced than the poor, or more likely to divorce their spouses than the poor. The poor would stay together better than the rich. As divorce became more common, eventually it got to where that more and more of them did not marry. And this was something I did not realize when I was doing my paper. There was a big increase in the number of bachelors and old maids. Now, in our bigger cities today, and most Americans live in or near a big city, anywhere from 1/2 to 2/3 of the adult population of our bigger cities in America are unmarried. How come the Roman population declined from 50 million to 30 million over a period of a couple hundred years? They simply largely stopped having children. They practiced abortion, yes, and they practiced infanticide. Christianity largely stopped both. The influence of the church, when the church took over, largely stopped both. But now, about the divorce situation, in 21st century America, we pride ourselves on going about pride. We look for 3 things in choosing a marriage partner. And they are oftentimes looks, personality, and money. And you might guess what I'm about to say next. Not any one of those 3 have anything at all to do with making a marriage work. If you don't believe it, ask Ted Turner. And when Ted Turner's last wife, Jane Fonda by name, left him, he said, I wish somebody could tell me how to make a marriage work. I wish I could tell him something too. I've been married 27 years, to only once in my lifetime. But was this Jane Fonda said he had a roving eye. Well, watch where your eyes are roving to, Mr. Turner. I mean, that might help. But anyway, Caesar Augustus saw this trend happening, and he tried to stem it he outlawed adultery as much as he could. Then he taxed heavily unmarried people, and of course we are doing the same thing. You may all know that if you're married, you pay a lower tax rate than persons who are not married. And also, you get an exemption for each child you have. In the case of Julius Caesar, he counted from 3 children up. For couples who had less than 3 children paid taxes at one rate. And if you had more than 3 children, you got taxes at a lower rate. The whole thing was to try to encourage couples to have children. The laws that he made were enforced, but they did not stem the trend toward the breakup of the family. The families continued to break up anyway. The wars had the effect of having made women more independent, and once the wars were over, they asserted this independence. Now, when the Vietnam War ended in 1973, some 200 or 300 prisoners of war who had been held for several years in North Korean camps were freed and allowed to come home. And most of them were divorced within a few months because they found out when they got home, their wives began to dress with shorter skirts than the husbands. Notice the dress styles had changed a lot in 8 years. Also, their wives were more independent. They'd all taken jobs, and in those days, not every woman worked. Today, of course, we do. But they found their wives were just so independent and so used to making their own decisions They just couldn't adjust to this anymore. They were expecting their wives to be one way, and they got home and found them another. And this, of course, was the same thing they had then. People would come home from the wars and oftentimes find their wives were more independent than they were before. Now, another problem they had was slavery. The wars brought a lot of slaves into Roman life. But then when the wars ended, during a period of peace, these slaves either died off or were given their freedom after so many years. And a couple would find themselves, they had this slave for a good many years, and one day after the time the slave was to serve expired, they had to turn their slave loose. It might have been 10 years, 15 years, or 20, but one day they turned their slave loose, and then there were so few slaves left, the price of them was so high that they could not afford to buy another one. And all of a sudden the woman had to do work that she had not done before, and she often resented. You mean I have to start doing dishes? I've never done that. You mean I have to start sewing and mending your clothes? Yes, you do. And the man would have to get out and dig with his own hands now, something he had not done before because the slaves were all gone. And this created a real strain on family life. As for the slaves rebelled often. The most famous rebellion was the rebellion of Spartacus, which occurred in 71. Now, in 1971, 1900 years later, no, actually that was 71 BCE, my bad, not really. But in 1971 they came out with a movie called Spartacus. Did any of you happen to see it? I mean, it's been around. Anybody? One person, two, okay, three, four, okay, good. You have somebody there. Anyway, Spartacus led a slave rebellion. A big problem he had was, among the slaves, nobody really knew who was in charge, whereas among the non-slaves, they had a hierarchy of authority, and everybody, the emperor was in charge, and you have, under the emperor, generals in the army. Under the generals, you have colonels. Under the colonels, you have captains, and under the captains, you have sergeants. And they had organizations, something the slaves were not able to do. Spartacus and tens of thousands of his followers were crucified. And what they made a rule that they said if a slave kills his master, all the slaves in that household will be killed. This was designed to make slaves think twice about killing the master, and also was designed to encourage slaves to tell the master if someone was planning to kill them. Now in our own country, we had Gabriel Prosser rebelled, Nat Turner rebelled, and in some cases, a slave would actually, who liked his master, would go to tell his master so-and-so is plotting to kill you at a certain night. And this happened in more than one occasion. The biggest slave rebellion that occurred in the Western Hemisphere occurred in Haiti in the late 1700s. That's off the subject a little bit, but they had the problem with slavery, and especially the big problem was when the slaves were freed, and very few people had the money to replace them, and they were not replaced. The gap between rich and poor again became larger. The poor did not care the least bit about politics. As the number of the idle poor people increased, trade fell off. You know, because the government was going to feed them, as the government fed more and more of its citizens, trade fell off. And of course, folks, you might have heard the saying, there's no such thing as a free lunch. The free lunches the government gave to the poor were being paid for by someone. And the result was the whole economic system of Rome eventually collapsed. Now, there was another problem that Rome had with its money, and this was something I mentioned in my paper 50 years ago. It's called an unfavorable balance of trade. The Silk Road led to silk and porcelains coming from China to Europe, which the wealthy aristocratic women just craved and liked, but it also led to Rome's gold finding its way to China. And I've talked to at least one Chinese man who said you can still go to China today and find Roman gold-made gold coins that found their way to China and never found their way back. The gold went one way, and after a while, Western Europe was left without gold. And Western Europe was plunged into a dark ages, partly because of a lack of gold and silver. And Western Europe was not to get gold back until the Spanish conquistadors went to the New World and found all this gold in the New World and brought it home, and Europe wound up having gold again. that gold was becoming a scarcer and scarcer commodity in Europe as a result largely of gold finding its way into India and China. There was a constant fear that these idle poor people would riot. Now, there was a big change made by an emperor who did little else that we remember him for, but an emperor named Caracalla. Caracalla made a law that everybody born inside Rome's borders was a citizen. Now, before this time, at first only Italians were citizens. Then Rome would make citizens out of the big leading citizens of the people they conquered. But Caracalla said everyone's a citizen. Now, citizens had special rights. The one right was a citizen could not be crucified. They could be beheaded, but could not be crucified. And another right was a citizen had the right to appeal his case to a higher court. Citizens could not be punished without a trial. All these rights that citizens had. If you know anything at all in Christian history, Jesus was not a citizen, but the next big spokesman of the Christian faith, Paul of Tarsus, was a citizen. And Paul used his citizenship often to keep from being beaten for one thing and to eventually appeal to Caesar for another. But the Emperor Caracalla made everyone citizens, and with that, the practice of crucifixion ended. Gladiatorial shows, the gladiators would fight each other to the death. And I'm out of time, I see. But I'll tell you what, I'll take up with this on Monday. Gladiators, again, they'd face each other with swords, and usually it ended with one of them killing the other. I'll go into more detail about that next time.
Are we going to have a review, do you think?
Actually, I've been spending the last 5 classes reviewing for the next test, and I've got one class between now and the next test, and it will be another review like this one, if that helps.
Yeah.
I don't mean to be facetious, but if I have time, if I run out of things to say, I'll go back and review. If I don't, because I have quite a bit to cover, what I have not mentioned. And again, if you listen to this morning's lecture, I go into detail about the founding of Christianity, which I've not gotten to in this class.